Good afternoon, everybody. Today, this afternoon, we have the distinct honor of listening to a question and answer session by Dr. David Titley, who is a professor of meteorology at Penn State University and a retired Rear Admiral in the U.S. Navy. Dr. Titley got a BA in meteorology from Penn State University, and while he was there, he was enrolled in Naval ROTC, and upon graduation, he became a naval officer, and he told me he spent about 8 years piloting or navigating ships for the Navy. But because of his background in meteorology, he was eventually sent by the Navy to its postgraduate school in Monterey, California, where he received both an MA and a PhD in meteorology. He served in many positions in the Navy having to do with meteorology, and among other things, he served as the director of the Navy's Center on Climate Change in the Pentagon. Upon retiring from the Navy as an admiral, he returned to his alma mater as a professor of meteorology and one of the main spokesmen for doing something about climate change in the country. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Titley. I think he will try to give you some sense of what he will be speaking about in his executive session later today, since this is a question and answer session. And following that little overview of what he will say at 2:30 today in his executive session, perhaps you could ask him some probing questions. Thank you very much. Without further ado, Dr. David Titley.
Okay, well, thanks very much for having me. This is, as I understand it, supposed to be a Q&A session here, a question and answer session. I understand I'm going up against like the Defense of the Free World, or Winston Churchill came back here to speak, or something like that. So, but I really appreciate everybody who is here. I'll just apologize right now that we're actually being filmed on C-SPAN, believe it or not. And because of the technical constraints on that, I have to be up here because I'm like 2 time zones away from you guys. I think I'm further away from you now than when I was at Penn State this morning. I would be down there and we'd have this way more informal, but we can't do that. So just bear with me, please. There are microphones there and on either side. So what I'm going to ask to do is, like, if you guys think of a question, just put your hand up and I'll ask, just again, really for the C-SPAN and so that everyone hears, if you can go to a microphone. Or is Harmony still here, or did she take off? She might have taken off. Okay, so just go to a microphone there and ask. If we get through, I have a few slides. Some of these I'm going to use at the plenary session, others not. So if we get through the slides, that's great. If we don't, that probably means we had a good discussion, and that probably makes me even happier. So without further ado, I'm just going to go through kind of a couple things and maybe a little bit more of a personal story than probably what I'll talk about in the plenary session. So what's this? Here's my first question. Oh yeah, and my students know this at Penn State. It's like, if you don't ask me questions, I ask you questions. So it's in your interest to ask me questions, actually. But since I don't see any hands up right now, I'll ask the first one. What is that? What is that black thing with the numbers on it? It's a sextant. What do you use sextants for? I'm sorry? I thought I heard an answer. Yeah, navigation. Navigation, it's actually for shooting the stars. So now, maybe the professors here remember, but I'll doubt if anybody else does. There was a time in this world where you did not just pull this thing up and it told you to within 10 meters of where you were on the planet. And especially when you went out on that ship, that was my first ship, USS Farragut, I got to be navigator, which was like the coolest job in the Navy, because you got to tell the captain where to go. Nobody else got to tell the captain where to go. But there was no GPS, there was no satellite navigation. It was really hadn't changed much for hundreds of years. You shoot the stars, and you use a lot of landmarks. And what you learn pretty quickly as navigator, otherwise you'd end up being a Walmart reader, is that you look at all the evidence, you kind of look at everything. You don't lock on, or you don't use any one particular thing 100%, but you look at everything, and then you use like kind of the gray matter, stuff in between your ears, and you say, okay, this is where we are, and this is where we're going. So why do I tell you all that? Because about 30 years after I had that like really, really cool job of driving that destroyer around and being navigator during the Cold War, the head of the Navy asked me to start and form the Navy's task force on climate change. And it was basically, Titley, I don't know if there's anything to this climate thing or not, but I got a bunch of people who are saying this is a big deal, especially in the Arctic. I got another bunch of people that says, nah, this is all, don't worry about it, you got other stuff you should do. So you tell me, you're supposed to be the oceanographer of the Navy, you're supposed to be smart on this weather stuff, go figure it out, let me know what we're supposed to do. Those were my marching orders. So I had about 2 weeks between the time that I was told, guess what, you're going to Washington and doing this, to go up there to the Pentagon. And what I used that time to do was to take a look at evidence. And as John mentioned, I mean, my background is actually as a meteorologist. And as a meteorologist, we know, I mean, especially back when I started doing this stuff, over 40 years, we'll just say over 40 years ago. It was a long time ago. Getting a 3-day forecast right was non-trivial. And yes, I know the jokes are it's still non-trivial today, but it was really hard. And you would see how the computer models could be really wrong really quickly. And you're seeing variations of 20, 30 degrees, and you're seeing the computer models are kind of garbage after 2 days. So, I mean, I was like a lot of meteorologists in the 70s and 80s and even 90s, and it's like, look, how can you tell anything? Really, how can you tell anything? So it wasn't that I had any particular political belief on this, but from a science point of view, I was not convinced that we could really do this. So fast forward to 2009, and I was told, hey, this is going to be your job, but tell me if there's something here. So what I just said is, okay, let's just put aside all my preconceived notions as best I can. I'm human, so you know we all have biases and stuff, but to the best I can, let's just put that aside, and let's see what is out here. And here's just a few examples of some of the stuff that I looked at. So if you look at the top left was air temperatures. This is globally average. And I know these are a little bit small graphs, but it basically starts from about the 1880s by decade, just every 10 years. Take a look at the temperatures, and that goes up to actually about 2010. The Arctic ice on the top right, this is how much ice is left in the late summer. Actually, right about now, within a week of today is actually the minimum amount of ice that you see in the Arctic Ocean. And that was that plot. And you can see in the last 30, 40 years how it's coming down. But maybe you say, well, you know, maybe the temperature record is screwed up. Maybe it's because we've been building cities, more people. It's not really reflecting what's really going on. You might have heard that. Some people say that. And say, well, okay. So the left one is actually kind of interesting. In Norfolk, Virginia, right on the coast, on the Virginia-North Carolina border, just north of there, this is actually a neighborhood in Norfolk called The Hague. And this is how many hours they're underwater per year. And again, the numbers themselves are kind of hard to see. The graph starts in like 1920, and they had a few hours. It's a pretty low line. They had a few hours back then, but you can kind of see where that graph is going. What does that tell me? It tells me either the land is going down or the seas are coming up. The seas are coming up. And then on the right is actually a big insurance company called Munich Reinsurance. And their only deal in this is they want to stay in business. So if you're a big insurance company, the way you stay in business is you've got to get the risk right, because the risk tells you how much you charge for the premiums, right? So they go figure out, and again, the colors don't mean that much to us right now, but the red stuff The red stuff is like earthquakes and volcanoes and tsunamis. And I would argue, at least for that 50 years or so, there's not much change. There's year to years up and down, but if you just look at the very bottom of that, the red stuff is pretty much flat. All the other stuff is weather and climate. And that's coming up. And this isn't how many dollars or whatever, this is just like how many big events do we have. So there's all my evidence. So, you know, if I go back to being a navigator, it's like, well, the evidence to me said, yeah, I really need to pay attention to this, and that's what we told the Navy. And the Navy then said, fine, we're going to do this task force on climate change. So that's kind of how it went. And I'll tell you, until I really looked at this stuff, this was about a decade ago, give or take, you know, I kind of thought, oh, this is a political thing, this is a this is a that. But when you looked at the evidence, you said, okay, this is real. And I'll talk in a couple slides here that kind of shows not only is this real, but when you dig into the science is actually being known for a long, long time. It's kind of weird in that regard. There hasn't been the big, oh my God, you know, we figured out something different. We've actually figured out the science back in the late 1800s in the 19th century, and we've been refining it ever since. But the basic science is still there. So let me stop here. Any questions on the evidence and sort of how I approached that? Any questions on, was this all that it took? Questions about weather? Anything on that? Sir? Yeah, please use the mic so everybody can hear.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what defines a catastrophe? I was just curious, what defines a catastrophe for the insurance company? Like, what defines what is a catastrophe?
Yeah, so the question is what is a catastrophe on that? I think for Munich Re, I think it was basically a magnitude of either the heat or the flooding. Most of that is heat or flooding. On the volcanoes, you know, they're pretty easy to measure, and tsunamis and earthquakes, you know, once you get above a certain magnitude. So it was much more the magnitude of a threshold of a physical event, as opposed to, you know, we had this huge, let's say, earthquake, but it was in the middle of a place where nobody lives, so therefore it doesn't count. They were just saying, no, we just count everything. So that's kind of how they did it. Yeah, sir. So the question of, you know, is there really enough evidence? And it's kind of interesting. One of my colleagues at Penn State is a professor named Mike Mann. And he actually does something called paleoclimate. So he tries to go back before the temperature records and using things like corals, tree rings, basically, let's see, what else does he do? He does a lot with the tree rings and a lot with the corals. You can drill into the ice cores, and that can get you back about 500,000 years. And you can basically, and you look at things like what kind of pollens get blown around. So using all those kinds of records, and you got to be careful, and you got to calibrate them and understand, just because you see something in like a Greenland ice core, was that local or was that global? But doing all that kind of hard science stuff, the details of the science, allows us to extend these records back several thousand years. And you may or may not have heard of something called the hockey stick. And it basically shows that like for the last 1,000 years, the temperatures have sort of been doing this. And then all of a sudden, in the last 50 years, they're going up like so. So it kind of gives this hockey stick shape to it. So yeah, when you sort of peel the next layer down from like the modern day record, you can use what they call the paleo record, and that evidence is still consistent with a long period of climate stability and now quite rapid change. John.
when the Navy asked you to form this task force on climate change and to look into it, they were looking at this from the perspective of a national security concern that the Navy might be involved in. I was wondering, were they thinking about climate change as something that would have an impact on how the Navy operated? Or were they thinking about it perhaps also about how climate change would exacerbate conflict in the world in many ways, and therefore basically require the Navy to act? Did they have an overarching sense that climate change could be a situation which exacerbated tensions between nations in many, many ways? Or were they thinking about it in a more local, tactical way, that climate change could affect the way the Navy operated, say, in the Arctic or something like that?
Okay, that's a really interesting question, and I'll tell you, back when I was asked to do this, because what sort of the full story is I was running the Navy's operational weather and ocean forecasting business. It's down in Mississippi, minding my own business, and I get the call from the head of the Navy, and my assistant, you get a lieutenant who's an assistant, and she basically says, sir, we call him the Chief of Naval Operations, it's like the head dude, and she's like, why is this guy calling my boss? So you're thinking, what are you thinking? What would you be thinking if all of a sudden, like, the president of the university is like calling one of you guys? What did I do wrong, right? Okay, yeah, so that's a first thought. And then the second thought is, I don't know exactly how it would work here, but usually, like, if it's the number one guy calling, that's usually okay. If it's the number two guy, like the deputy or the provost or somebody, or the executive vice president, they're usually the guys and gals that get to say, yeah, this is, you're not doing so good here. We're going to make a change. So the number one guy, okay, so this is okay. So we basically said, and it was really, John, to your point, it was about the Arctic. Specifically, the Navy, when they asked me to go up, they wanted me to form basically an Arctic task force. And what I did in those sort of 2 weeks that I had between going up and having to tell the Navy what we're going to do is I was able to show enough evidence to say, bosses, CNO, yes, the Arctic we need to look at because this is one of the nearest term big changing events going on, and it has potential very, very significant ways the Navy would operate. I call it opening up a fifth ocean for the first time in hundreds of years. Last time we found a new ocean, it was because of Columbus. But I also said that this is really just a harbinger of things to come, and that the Arctic is really the leading edge of this climate issue, which is going to affect the military, not just the U.S. Navy, but the militaries in many ways. And I didn't say exactly how. There had been concurrently to me a think tank called CNA. It used to be Center for Naval Analysis, but like all these places now, they're just known as CNA. I'm not allowed to say Center for Naval Analysis anymore. I don't know why not. They have something called the Military Advisory Board, a bunch of retired 3- and 4-stars, and about the same time I was going up to the Pentagon, they came out with a report, so it's an independent report, not part of the Pentagon, and they basically said that climate change was going to be what their term was a threat multiplier. So if any of you remember like the old BASF commercials, remember we don't make things, we make things better? Climate change is sort of the opposite of that. We don't make stuff, but we make it worse. Climate change kind of takes an existing threat and makes it more challenging. And we're seeing that. We saw that play out in the Arab Spring. We're seeing it play out right now in the Fertile Crescent in Syria. And there's a whole story that I'll go through in the plenary session on linking this. And the link is not anywhere near as simple as we had climate, it changed, now we have ISIS, and now we have a massive refugee issue in Europe. But it's rather like a causal chain of events, and one thing leads to another, that leads to another, and you can kind of think of all those links in the chain. And like if you break a link in the chain, you no longer have a really bad outcome. Climate is just one of the links in the chain. You could argue if you didn't have President Assad, you might have had, you had a decent government in Syria. They would have been able to deal with some of the climate challenges that they have. They may not have tried to become self-sufficient in food in the 1970s, which means, everybody grow your own food. Sounds really good, but if you don't have enough water, what happens? You use up all the groundwater. And that's okay right until you get a really bad drought, which is what they had. And now they have no groundwater. And oh, by the way, in the Iraq War, nearly 1 million Iraqis went into Syria, so that was a big issue. And then now that you have the farmers that really can't grow anything because they've used all the water, and it is hotter and drier, and there's a pretty good climate link to that, but now there's no plan B or plan C or plan D. So they've gone into the cities, right? And the whole place collapses. And again, it's run by this guy Assad. It's not who you want as your president. So you take all those things together, and you end up with a really, really horrific situation in the Middle East. Climate is one of those contributing factors. And I say this because I kind of cringe when I see the headline, "Climate Change Caused ISIS." But climate was one of the contributing factors. We got a really bad drought in California, arguably the worst in hundreds of years, but we don't have ISIS in California yet. So we don't have ISIS in California, and that's because we have governance, we have safety nets. We have ways to mitigate this, at least for now, whereas Syria did not. So I hope that answers that, John. So yeah, we started off kind of narrow. I tried to broaden the scope of what our task force could look at. And I mean, I've kind of talked about some of these things. Let me step it down to be a little bit more. I'm not going to talk about that. I'll talk about this. This is a graph. Actually, I didn't have the colors on it. And we all know on PowerPoint, right? If it's a color, it must be true. You guys aren't science. You see in the science, if somebody shows me a color graph, it's like, oh yeah, this is great. But this was actually very simple. And I used a graph just like this to brief actually the heads of the world's navies, about 70 heads of navies in Newport, Rhode Island, a couple falls ago. And it really doesn't have a whole lot of even saying things like climate on it. And it's because this is really getting down to the, don't tell me the temperatures are rising by 2 degrees or 3 degrees, or tell me that ecosystem thing is changing. Tell me what it means to the militaries. So this is kind of in, I will apologize but not apologize, it's kind of in military ease. But if you look down the far left column, the Arctic is changing. We mentioned that. The ice is coming out at an astounding rate. Most people believe, and I'm in this camp, that probably sometime in the 2020s or by the early 2030s, we'll start seeing several weeks each year in which there's basically no sea ice in the Arctic, which is an amazing trend that has happened literally in your lifetimes. Even 10 or 15 years ago, people thought that would take at least a century or a couple centuries to happen. And rather than taking centuries, it's taking a few decades. It's happening much, much faster. And we can talk about all the implications that means to a navy. The bases and disaster relief, a lot of people talk about you see a big typhoon in the Pacific. We send ships, the US Navy sends ships, and the Army and the Air Force, they fly in troops and supplies. It's called Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief, and because we're part of the DoD, we have to have an acronym, so we call it HADR. But it's the disaster relief. I have that in green. Honestly, certainly Western militaries, the Japanese military, the Chinese military is getting better at this. A lot of militaries can do this pretty easily. Now, if you keep doing it enough and enough and enough, you'll get a capacity issue, but it's pretty easy to do. The impacts to bases, this is like rising sea levels, droughts, forest fires. Those are coming up, and sort of in the longer term, I sort of got that yellow kind of color on there. But at least for the bases, it's probably still a few decades out until we really see the big effects. But the things I've got, in the yellow to orange, the Arctic is changing very fast, as I mentioned. And even just in the last year, you now have Russia that has certainly built up their capabilities, but their intentions are frankly much harder to understand. There's a lot of very bellicose rhetoric coming out of Russia, and how much of that is for internal consumption, how much of that is for doing other things, and how much of that is like, hey, we mean it. You know, I'm of the view that you can't just discount this entirely because, you know, little pop quiz, what is the nation that just went and invaded a sovereign independent European nation? Oh yeah, that would be Russia. So, you know, you can't just sort of like ignore all the bombastic rhetoric because they have invaded places recently. So the Arctic is kind of a wild card. And then these security threats, these geostrategic threats that we've talked about, like Arab Spring, like the Syria, that stuff's happening right now. Okay, any questions on this? Yeah.
Have they actually done anything specifically in response to this analysis?
So the question was, has the Navy done anything in response to this analysis? The Navy has a couple of things out, and now the Department of Defense, who of course the Navy's part of, has kind of, since I've left, has sort of taken over a lot of this. So there is actually a fair amount of high-level documentation. There are strategic plans, there are planning documents, there are roadmaps as far as what to do. I would say on the disaster relief, we've got that covered. The bases, they're certainly thinking through what the bases are going to do, and as you recapitalize infrastructure, how do you build it so it either needs less fresh water, it can have its own power supply, it can be more resilient, you understand where the critical dependencies are. If it's near the ocean, you know, you're almost always like part of a town. It does you no good to like armor, I'll call it armor up, put hard levees around a base if all your workforce lives in the town and all you're doing is you're shunting the water out of your base and into their kitchen. You're not going to have a workforce. So, like down in Norfolk, Virginia, there is a pilot project to try to put all the pieces of government, the federal, regional, local governments together, and it's actually being funded by the White House to figure out how do you get, like, and there's, when you add it up, there's like 36 different agencies. They got to play nice together because they're all going to, you know, sorry for the cliche, but they're all going to sink or swim together down there. And they've at least realized that they can't have their own independent solutions. The geostrategic risks, I think, is something that the Department of Defense needs to continue to really think about. There's good work on, as I said, on the bases and on infrastructure. I think they need to think, continue to think seriously about these geostrategic risks. To me, those are the scariest ones. They will probably paradoxically look least like climate issues, but they could have the biggest threats. Yeah, 1 and 2.
You're talking about how flooding is going to be a big issue for some of these smaller towns, but what about more heavily populated areas such as like New York, Houston, New Orleans, and even like probably the state of Florida as well? What are the plans in place for those bigger areas?
I understand St. Louis is a nice place to live. It is going to be, as we continue through the 21st century, and certainly into the 22nd century, this is going to be a huge issue. So you'll see it like in the science literature, there's a lot of debate about how much sea level rise are we going to get to the year 2100. And there's something called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, probably many of you have heard of that. They're actually very conservative. They're talking about roughly 2 feet-ish in there. There was something called the National Climate Assessment. It said it's going to be somewhere between 6 inches and 7 feet. It's like, my response is, well, my mother could tell me that. As we keep going, the consensus is becoming more and more like about 3 feet. But the thing which I think a lot of people are missing is the oceans are not going to stop melting in the year or the ice is not going to stop melting in the year 2100. The ice doesn't know that it's 2100, and that's all as far as our projections go. And in fact, it keeps accelerating. So Long term, I will honestly be dead by the time this is an issue. You ladies and gents who are students now, you will be at least my age or a little older when this is really becoming an issue. But your children, no kidding, are going to have a massive issue on this. You know how much money we spent redoing the levees around New Orleans after Katrina? $14.6 billion. 14.6. You know how much money we have put into Miami or New York or Houston since then? Basically nothing. You know, so great. You know, Katrina became the poster child for a little while. We dumped a ton of money into there. And we've got a system which now, in fact, I was just doing some research on this a few weeks ago. In about 2 or 3 decades, that levee system is not going to be big enough to deal with sea level rise. So they're going to ask for another 10 or 20 billion. You got Houston, you got Tampa, you got Miami, not to mention Jacksonville and Norfolk. Oh, Sandy, yeah, that was 60 billion right there. So this is going to be, that sea level one over time is going to be the dominant issue over time, but it's going to take time to get there. Nearer term, the security threats in the Arctic are probably going to dominate this this issue, but you're right. I mean, the sea level rise issue, especially as we get late into the 21st century and the 22nd century, unless we get really serious about carbon mitigation, basically getting off carbon fuels like now, this is what's going to happen. And I tell people, you know, the ICE doesn't caucus with the Democrats or the Republicans. It doesn't watch MSNBC or Fox or C-SPAN. But the ICE just melts. It doesn't care about our politics, and it's just melting. And that's going on. So, ma'am, you had a question, and then sir. Oh, sir, go on. Sorry. And if I can get you to be up on the microphone there, please. Yes, sir.
So I was wondering if the United States had any particular special interest in the Arctic besides security threats from Russia. I don't know why we would be investing so much money in building boats or other things that could handle that kind of capacity of ice when we do have kind of impending threats at home.
Okay, it's a great. The question is like, so why should we care about the Arctic? Is that a fair paraphrase?
Yeah.
Okay, given that we've got a lot of other issues, and I think up to now, I would say you have accurately summarized U.S. policy in the Arctic. We do some nice science up there. We're recognized as a science powerhouse in the Arctic, but we really haven't done any infrastructure. I don't know if any of you ladies or gents have been up in the Arctic or not. There's just not much up there. Even today, there's just not much up there. The issues are going to be that the shipping routes really will be moving up there. Not today, not tomorrow, but they will be moving up there. The shipping routes, as I'm sure everybody knows here, they are the warehouses of the world. We really don't have warehouses anymore. We've got a bunch of container ships. So our economy shuts down if those ships and those shipping routes don't keep going. And that will affect not only people in the ports, but then everybody who makes stuff or wants to sell stuff, including farmers in the Midwest. So the shipping routes are one. You can argue whether we should or should not be looking for more fossil fuels, but if the policy is to continue to look for fossil fuels, the Arctic is one of the places where there's still a lot. Now, you could, again, I think make some very credible arguments that the risks are extremely high in the Arctic. The costs are high, but we're going to have to see, you know, what are the alternatives, and we need to get serious. I would argue personally we need to get serious about that. There are certainly other minerals up there. We see a lot of tourism going up there. Tourism is a big driver in economies writ large. We see much increased tourism going up there. And the other part is it's sovereign U.S. territory. I think you did mention the security as part of it, but like we don't just say, you know, the Coast Guard's kind of out of money, so we're just going to let Florida go to anybody who wants to have it. We don't say that. Why would we say the same to Arctic? Why would the Department of Homeland, in fact, here's a question. Who's coming here tomorrow, right? Secretary Johnson, right? Ask him this question. Why would you spend, sir, you can say sir, all these billions of dollars to harden our borders in the lower 48, whereas basically you don't have a clue what's going on up in Alaska. Anybody could walk into Alaska, get themselves an airline ticket with a made-up driver's license, and you can fly Alaska Airlines out of Barrow or out of Prudhoe Bay, and you're in the U.S. Boom. You know, it's like the Maginot Wall. I've just gone around it. You know, I mean, so it is U.S. sovereign territory, and we should treat it as such. It's not like, oh yeah, it's that thing that the president goes to, and now we've all forgot where he went. So those are issues in the U.S. Arctic. This picture I have up here, it sort of looks like something that came out of Episode 2 of Star Wars. It did not. This is an island called Svalbard. Anybody knows where Svalbard is? It is to the northeast of Greenland. It is Norwegian kind of territory. There's something called the Treaty of Svalbard, came out of World War I. And it basically says, yeah, it's basically Norwegian, but anybody else who signs this treaty can be there as well. So like the Russians are there. We don't really define, the treaty is very ill-defined, who owns, who has control of the waters around it. The Norwegians think they do, but they're not sure. So a couple things up there is really interesting. One is, you know, that we've got a whole bunch of communications and electronic satellites that sort of go around the Earth like this. They're called polar orbits. Svalbard is up so close to the North Pole, you can actually control those satellites every single time it goes over the North Pole. And that's what these domes are. There's about 60 domes up on this plateau. And they've got a good workforce, they've got internet. Actually, the internet works better there than it does at my house. And it is a place where you can really do space control. Think of everything that runs off of space. So this is up in the Arctic here. The other part that, you know, for anybody, we had any like international affairs students here, political scientists? Okay, so NATO, right? We all know about NATO. Okay, Norway's part of NATO, right? And what's Article 5? You raised your hand, so I'm going to ask you, what is Article 5? Okay, who else can tell me? What student can tell me what Article 5 is?
Is it an attack on NATO or attack on any member of NATO?
Exactly. Yeah, so it's an attack on one is an attack on all. I'm paraphrasing and simplifying, but that's basically it. So you have this island up here, not totally defined. The Norwegians, valued member of NATO, really think it's theirs. The Russians actually have a settlement on here. And the Russians go and poke at the Norwegians pretty hard. In fact, the Norwegians found out that the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia, who is under sanctions because of the Ukraine incident, he was on Svalbard. How did the Norwegians find out? Through the press, through the media. So they weren't really happy. Do you think the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia just accidentally ended up on Svalbard? No, it was a message. So the Russians, this is what they do. They poke and they find weaknesses and they look for splits and seams in the alliance. So here's something going on in the Arctic, increased human activity, strategic space, and now it's kind of ground zero in the Russia versus Europe kind of pushing and shoving matches that are going on. Everybody says the Russians wouldn't be that dumb, we wouldn't be that dumb. You know, that's what we all said before World War I, right? Nobody would be that dumb to get into something like that. We did. So one thing I've learned in 32 years in the Navy is never underestimate the power of people to make miscalculations. Sir.
Does it work?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm kind of diverting the conversation somewhere else now, but knowing very well from your study, and I think from what I've heard, we clearly understand the direction in which our climate's heading. And I think it was yesterday when I heard a statement that was made, and it says that if insects were to die tomorrow, life on Earth would cease to exist within several years. If humans were to die tomorrow, life on Earth would flourish in several years. So my question to you is, how do we as human beings, can we reverse our climate, or can we only slow down what is seen to be the inevitable? Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Okay, it's a great question, and the answer is yes, we can if we want to, if we decide we have the will, and that's that's the great question. Will we have the will? Sometimes we have seen that people actually are collectively pretty smart, and we do some pretty smart things. But unfortunately, we also have seen where people sometimes are collectively not so smart. I wrote an op-ed in Science last summer. I called it Ghost of the Past. And I actually related our lack of action on climate change to how the European powers got themselves into World War I, which everybody said couldn't happen and all this. But there was a tremendous amount of hubris and ignoring the risks, and we ended up with an awful situation. So, but I'll talk about, I brought this slide up because it sort of gets to my, okay, so what can we do? Now, the first thing we know is if you want to go viral on the internet, what do you need? Cute cats. I don't have any cute cats, I'm sorry. But I do have a cute llama, so I'll use the LLMA. And the first L is basically learn, and just the basics. I mean, there's something that the American Association of Advancement for Science put out called What We Know About Climate, What We Know. And it's like 16 pages, and it's got a lot of figures in it. It's written at, I think, the grade 11 or grade 12 level. And I'll tell you, if people read that, you would know everything the general public needs to know about climate change. You'd know more than 95% of the people. If that's not good enough, the National Academies and the Royal Society put out about a 30-page thing that's probably written at about the 12th grade level, and now you're up to the 99th percentile of knowledge. So it's not like, oh my God, I got to be Michael Mann. No, there's literally probably the amount of time that you would sort of spend on 2 commutes. You can read enough to have a working knowledge, a sufficient citizen working knowledge of climate. That's all. I'm not trying to like troll for people to get master's degrees at Penn State in climate science. The second L is basically local action. And local actions, what can you do? So I'll just give a little story. We moved from Washington, D.C. to Penn State. Obviously, got a budget, like everybody else does when you go buy a house. And our kind of choices were we could have a really big, nice house that was about 6 or 7 miles away from the university, and I'd drive every day. Or we could have a smaller, somewhat older house, but it was within walking distance of my office. And that's what we chose. And then we've been able to, as time and finances have allowed, we've upgraded the windows. We found a couple pieces that it was what I call the Pennsylvania rural style of architecture, which means there was no insulation. So we put insulation in, that really helps. And we basically tried to build it so that it's energy efficient. I don't know that I can get solar on it. I think I have to knock a neighbor's house down, and they somehow don't seem really happy about that. But then I would have much better southern exposure. They seem to be grumpy about that. So we may not do that, but okay. But there are things you can do when you buy your next car. Think about the gas mileage. I'm not saying that you have to just have a bicycle and get rid of whatever. And if you're working on a farm, you probably need a pickup. Okay, that's fair. But if all you're doing is taking your kids, to the hockey game and the soccer game, and you're in, I don't know, Jacksonville, Florida, where it never snows, maybe you don't need a pickup or a big SUV. Maybe you can have something that gets 35 or 40 or 45 miles per the gallon. So just, and this is not live in a cave and wear a hair shirt or anything, but what can you do? And there's a ton of stuff. What is it? In rough terms, I think we as Americans, we waste about 1/3 of our energy, 1/3 of our food, 1/3 of our water, roughly. So, I just try to think of, okay, what little things can I do that sort of knock that down? Am I perfect? No way. I'd be the last person to say I'm perfect. But we try to work on that. So there's local action you can do. The N, I realize, is a little geeky. It's kind of for my science friends. We don't do a very good job of monitoring the Earth to really understand in a consistent sort of scientific time series way how things are changing. And if you don't know how things are changing, it's really hard to say how they're changing. So the M is monitoring, and that's really just supporting NASA and NOAA in their missions because they get beat up by the Congress a lot. And then the A is advocacy. And the way I look at this is whenever you, and I use the broad you, have an opportunity to engage with elected officials really at any level from federal on down. I mean, my question is, sir or ma'am, what are you doing to stabilize the climate? So that's not, do you support revenue neutral carbon tax? Do you support cap and trade? It's kind of like dating 101, don't ask a yes or no question. But what you do is, it's an open-ended question. You might get a thoughtful answer. But even if you do not get a thoughtful answer, what you get is somewhere in the back of that politician's brain is registered. It's like, oh, a constituent actually cared enough to ask about this. And if enough of us do, I mean, Congress probably won't lead on this issue, but they can be led. They will follow the voters because they want to get reelected. Right now, I mean, I hate to say it, but right now, this issue just doesn't really register that much. There's a few people really committed. There's a few people who think it's all be, you know what. And most of the rest of the people, we kind of, it's like watching the dish pan sort of slosh around. It's really thin and kind of depends. We need to have enough advocacy to say, yeah, this is important, and especially in places where you have a politician who's like on the center, or even better yet, center-right, so that they feel, he or she feels like, I'm not going to get fired by the voters if I stick my hand up and says, you know, maybe we need to look at this thing. There's a guy named Bob Inglis. He was a congressman in upstate South Carolina. And in 2010, he basically said, you know, and he's, hardcore conservative. He can quote the Bible with the best of them, all that kind of stuff. But he said, you know, maybe these guys aren't crazy. These science guys, maybe they're not crazy. Maybe we should at least figure out what it is they're saying. And basically the voters, gave him a blindfold and a cigarette, and they shot him in the next primary. So now he's a climate hero, but he's a climate hero that's out of a job, or at least out of Congress. And all the other, people on the center, on the right, on the Republicans said, I don't want to be Bob Inglis. That wasn't any fun. So we are the ones who are going to ultimately provide that advocacy. We know intellectually this is super, super important for the long term. If we ignore it today, tomorrow, yeah, okay. But it's super, super important. But it's going to be for us, ultimately, in our system of government, to give the Congress enough top cover so that they can take those votes and not get fired by their electorate. So that's my way more than 2 cents worth, but answers that. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I was just wondering what governmental policies you would first like to see from the United States.
What governmental policy? Well, the first thing to know is I probably couldn't even get elected as dog catcher, so it's not going to matter what that is. I would at least explore, and I don't do the detailed policies, so I probably should not even say anything, but I will. I would explore some of the ideas that places or organizations like Citizens Climate Lobby has of the so-called revenue neutral carbon tax. And if you really construct it so that it's revenue neutral, can you convince folks who think already that our government is either too big or certainly should not be bigger, that money in fact goes back to maybe people who really do need help with their energy, but you at the same time basically probably remove subsidies for renewables, but at the same time remove subsidies for fossil fuels. And there's big time subsidies for fossil fuels, for oil and for coal. And you price, have some sort of fair price for, in fact, the kind of damage that the carbon pollution is doing. So we've sort of been dumping the trash, you see like the Monty Python movies of medieval times or whatever, and people just dumping the trash out their doorstep. That's kind of what we've been doing. So we haven't been picking up the trash for 150 years. Little factoid, every man, woman, and child in America every day generates about 120 pounds of carbon dioxide. That's when you average it all out. That's the kind of number. So, that's a lot. And we haven't done anything with the trash. We don't dispose of it. It's just out there. Now we can't see it, we can't touch it, so we don't really see it that way. But it's a lot. And it has been harming the ecosystems. And again, why do I care about the ecosystems? Because ultimately people depend on that. Somebody brought that up. If the bugs go away, that's bad. If it's just people that go away, maybe not quite so bad, unless you're a person. So so that there is real harm to the things that sustain us: fresh water, the ability to have productive agriculture, the ability to have our cities and our centers of commerce in places that we know are not going to get totally flooded out by the ocean. All those things. So I'm actually writing something right now, hopefully it'll be published next week, that says, we're paying a carbon tax today. Those $14.6 billion in levies, that $60 billion for Sandy, that's kind of a carbon tax that we're paying today. So the question is like, are we going to pay a carbon tax that we vote on? Or are we just going to keep paying carbon taxes after bad things happen and it's after the fact? And we know we're going to do it. We're not going to walk away from New York City. We're not going to walk away from Los Angeles. We're not going to walk away from Napa, California, which are just north of there, or New Orleans, or pick your place, Miami. We're going to pay. We're going to pay. So we can either decide how we're going to pay, or we can just be told how to pay after the fact. But that I would start with that. It may not be the best policy, but I would start the discussion with that. Sir, and then we'll go.
Sir, my question to you is, you mentioned about reducing fossil fuel consumption or reducing CO2 levels, and my question is, do we have a viable alternative? Because other than using fossil fuels for like oil consumption, we also use it for plastics and so many other things. So is there a way that we can actually have a viable alternative?
Let me see, do I have that slide in this deck, or it'll be in the next one. What I think we look at on there is a couple things. One, despite kind of what we've been doing, a lot of the renewables are starting to become competitive just on price. Now again, how much of that is subsidies, but then the fossil guys have subsidies, and it's really hard to disentangle all that. But sort of by themselves, they're getting close. I would, again, maybe this gets back to your question, ma'am, if I were king for a day, which I will never be, but if you look at how the US over the last 50 or 60 years, when we have a problem and we all say we have a problem, we tend to invest our research and development pretty heavily to try to fix that problem. So there is a graph, and I'm afraid I just don't have it in this deck, but it's maintained by the American Association for Advancement of Science, and it's the non-defense research and development. I know this sounds really geeky and wonky and all that kind of stuff, but what it is, and it's kind of color-coded by what it is, and you could see almost to the year, or to the day, when President Kennedy said, we're going to go to the moon, and you watch the U.S. investment in space go like this, and then go like this. You could actually see in the 1973 oil shock that, believe it or not, we put a lot more money into investing in energy, but then it all kind of went away. So we have a lot of rhetoric in the president's second term. We have the Congress who hasn't bought into this by and large. But when you look at the money, when you look at the budgets on research and development, we really haven't done much. We've done a little, but nothing that sort of aligns to what this country has done in the past when we say we've got a problem, or we need to fix something. And I think that's going to be another way to drive the cost down. And we've seen this time and time again. You know, if you invest heavily, by and large, you can drive these costs down, and you can get probably solutions that we're not even thinking of. You know, the military's done this time and time again. We all know the stories: GPS, transistors, the internet, all that kind of stuff. But we're not going to do that at $200 or $300 million a year. We're just not going to get there. Who else had? Yeah, go ahead. Time for the bonus rounds here.
So I found it interesting that we were talking about how climate change creates a lot of conflicts globally, when it is inherently a global phenomenon, an issue that affects everyone on Earth. So I think it's kind of hard for me to say, but I'm thinking that there should be more of a synergistic attitude toward climate change. Like, it's great that we can talk about policies that we can take on in this country and kind of get the public involved and everybody can reduce by a little bit, you know, in their house kind of thing. And those are all great, but like, I feel like this is such a global crisis that we need to be talking to other countries as well. So what kind of policies do you think should be, or stands we should be taking? I mean, I know we have like those global conferences on climate change, but those are rather ineffective. I don't know, like, if you have any other suggestions, or how can we really unite countries to fight this issue?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. When you take a look at, you know, where the carbon pollution is coming from, you know, I mean, the U.S. is now number 2. We're not even the single largest country. Now, per capita, we're the single largest country, but overall, I mean, China actually has surpassed us. This is something, you know, we've talked about evidence, and this is a belief. I don't have as much evidence for this, but it is a belief that America can still lead the world in many, many things. And the world, in large cases, does still look to American leadership. So, yeah, I was talking about, you know, whether we invest and all the way down to, you know, small-scale actions and getting enough support in Congress so we look like we kind of have a unified position to the outside world. It's like, oh, they're serious now. That, I think, then puts our negotiators and our senior politicians in a much, much stronger position to say, okay, this is what we're doing and we're serious. You know, will we share the technology? That would be something we could do. How would you, you know, if you want to set like a, you know, big hairy goal, it's like how, let's say by the year 2100, 2110, would we assure non-carbon-based power to every single person on this planet at least the year, like a level of what an average European has today? You know, maybe can you do that? Can you not do that? But not go build a whole bunch of coal-fired things, but how do you go figure out, and it's not only the building of non-carbon, it's how do you store that energy? How do you move that energy? Those are places we could invest. So I think it starts at home with credibility, because otherwise it's like it's talk, but you guys aren't doing anything. But once you have that, I mean, I would use American leadership, and maybe that sounds corny or not, but I do believe that America can still lead. But we've got to have credibility to do that. We can't be the laggard and tell everybody else that they should be fixing this problem. How are we doing? Any, one last question? Any last questions? Sir.
I appreciated Nathan Fox's question because that brings us back to something I wanted to ask a number of minutes ago. And that is, it seems to me that climate change is a scientific problem, political problem, economic problem. To me, it's also a moral problem. It's a moral problem for the following reason. Boston, or Miami, or Houston face rising sea level, we have the technology and the money to respond. Just as my adopted country of the Netherlands had technology and had money to respond, and so my house in the Netherlands was 18 feet below sea level, but I was not fearing for my life. A number of countries around the world that are going to be severely threatened, I think, by rising sea levels have neither the technology nor the money to resist. Bangladesh and the Maldives would be just two examples. So one piece I would appreciate your commenting upon would be the moral dimension of climate change.
Yeah, it's a wonderful comment there, and the reason I put this slide up is I think we've seen, and I label it good news very intentionally, is we have seen in the last couple of years more and more different groups from their perspective, including the moral perspective. So I got something, I work with this group called Catholic Climate Covenant, which is a guy named Dan Meisler. He's a layperson, but super guy, runs this. Pope obviously had his encyclical come out. I was actually just down in Norfolk on a panel with a couple of bishops talking about that. I would do the science security thing, and they would say, okay, this is what the Pope means here, and this is why it's a moral issue if you're a follower of Catholic teachings. Same thing with the evangelicals. I'm doing a panel with some Jewish organizations in Philadelphia here in about 2 months. So what I've seen, and that moral component or religious component, let's say that's at 12 o'clock, you can sort of go around here. The insurance guys, for insurance reasons, are doing it. Another moral component, I mean, it's kind of a kooky symbol I use, but the divestment of fossil fuels from universities. Harvard did that. The president of Harvard, my personal opinion, was pretty condescending to the people who started that. She said, don't worry, children. We know what we're doing. Fortunately, the students said, no, I don't think you do, ma'am. And they're going to keep pushing on that. The health aspect. I talk about the security aspect. James Baylog, Chasing Ice, has some dramatic, fine, you don't believe all my data? Go watch Chasing Ice. It's pretty impressive. And yes, I do have my polar bear floating out on the ice because, in all fairness, the environmental movement has been talking about this issue for decades. And Hank Paulson, Risky Business. The business guys are saying, "Hey, we got to know the price. We've got to know this." I think it's very, very useful to have all of these talking to their stakeholders with credibility. But we're all coming to the same answer of we have to deal with this. Short term, we're going to have to adapt. Long term, we have to get ourselves off carbon because otherwise the consequences, I think I was saying at lunch, the Earth will be fine, but the ecosystems may not make it. But we'll make it. Okay, I think, is that it? All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Dr. Titley will be giving his executive session at 2:45 in the Coulter Science Lecture Hall, his full-blown presentation. You're all invited to that as well.